the dead. The souls of the departed, he said, were beyond the reach of candles and coins. No priest could sway the judgment of God with chants or fees. Salvation, he believed, could not be bought. And most dangerously of all, Peter rejected the church's claim to speak for God. He called it corrupted, useless, and unnecessary for salvation. A staggering claim in a time when questioning the clergy was seen as heresy, and heresy as treason against heaven. Peter's message began to spread. He traveled from village to village across Provence, Dauphiné, and the Rhône Valley. His followers, called Petrobrusians, gathered in fields, in homes, and in the corners of towns. They were not soldiers. They carried no weapons, but they carried doubt. And in a society built on absolute belief, doubt could be more dangerous than blades. Not all who heard him agreed. Some were deeply troubled. His rejection of the Mass offended devout worshippers. His destruction of crosses enraged those who saw the crucifix as sacred. His denial of infant baptism frightened parents who feared for the souls of their children. The church took notice. He was condemned in sermons, labeled a heretic by leading theologians like Peter the Venerable, Abbot of Cluny. In a long and scathing refutation, Peter the Venerable outlined and attacked each of his teachings, calling them false, dangerous, and born of arrogance. But Peter of Bruys did not stop. He seemed unconcerned with institutional approval. He did not seek debate or reconciliation. He did not attend councils or submit to bishops. He simply walked, spoke, and believed. And then he came to Saint-Gilles, a town like many others, modest, pious, and known for its devotion to St. Giles, a beloved Christian hermit whose relics drew pilgrims from across the region. The shrine in Saint-Gilles was sacred. The townspeople guarded it fiercely. Their lives were woven around its rituals and processions, its masses and festivals, and into this town came a man who denied it all. We do not know his exact words on that final day. Perhaps he condemned the shrine. Perhaps he burned another cross. Perhaps he stood in the square and declared that the bones they venerated were just bones, that the God they sought did not live in stone buildings or jeweled reliquaries. Whatever he said, it was enough. The crowd turned on him. This was no formal arrest, no trial, no ecclesiastical inquisition. It was immediate, furious, visceral. The people of Saint-Gilles seized him. There were no robes, no judges, no appeals, just hands, many hands, dragging him through the streets. They built a pyre, a bonfire, perhaps originally for a celebration or festival, repurposed now for judgment. They tied him, or perhaps they simply threw him in. The fire was lit. He was burned alive, not by church decree but by public rage. The same people who filled the pews, who kissed the relics, who lit candles in the chapel, those were the ones who watched him burn. And then they left. The flame was meant to end the story, but Peter of Bruys would not vanish so easily. Though his movement quickly scattered, elements of his teaching lingered, picked up by other groups who years later would come to challenge the church in far larger numbers. The Cathars, the Waldensians, the Lollards, the early Protestants, all, in different ways, would echo ideas he once whispered in the town squares of France. Today, Peter is remembered not for the size of his following, but for the depth of his conviction. He asked dangerous questions at a time when silence was safe. He refused to bow, even when fire waited. His death is a reminder that medieval executions were not always handed down from courts or castles. Sometimes they came from fear, from neighbors, from crowds that could not bear to have their certainties questioned. In Peter's world, religion was not just personal, it was communal. It was woven into identity. To challenge it was to unravel the very fabric of life. And so the fire became a thread, burning its way through the past and into memory. There is no grave for Peter of Bruys, no statue, no shrine, only the lingering question he left behind. What happens when belief becomes so strong, so immovable, that it is willing to silence all others? As the smoke fades and the cobblestones cool, we turn again to the next name, the next place, the next moment when words became wounds and conviction met its final test. not in argument, but in agony. Let us continue. Morning mist drifted gently across the cobbled streets of Constance, as if unaware that this day would end in fire. The bells rang softly from the cathedral spire, echoing over Lake Constance and the sloping rooftops of the old imperial town. Merchants unpacked their goods, monks recited their morning prayers, but one man sat chained in a dark chamber, waiting to be led out, not to freedom, nor to trial, but to a stake of wood and straw. His name was Jan Hus, and his journey to this moment had begun not with rebellion, but with a book, a pulpit, and a belief that the church had lost its way. Hus was born around 1372 in the Bohemian village of Husinek, his surname meaning goose in Czech, a name that would echo ironically through history. Like many of humble origins, he turned to education as a means of rising above his station. He studied theology and philosophy at the University of Prague and quickly distinguished himself, not just as a scholar, but as a thinker willing to question. By the time he was ordained, Hus had already begun to see cracks in the towering edifice of church authority. Corruption was rampant. Bishops lived in palaces. Simony, the sale of sacred offices, was openly practiced. And perhaps most troubling of all, salvation itself had become transactional. Indulgences were sold like wares at a market. Penance could be purchased, forgiveness advertised for the right price. From the pulpit of Bethlehem Chapel in Prague, Hus began to speak out. His sermons were delivered not in Latin, but in the language of the people. He preached that Christ, not the Pope, was the true head of the church, that the authority of Scripture outweighed the decrees of councils, that a priest who lived in sin had no spiritual power at all. To many, his words felt like fresh air. To others, they reeked of heresy. His ideas were deeply influenced by the earlier writings of John Wycliffe, the English theologian who had argued for reform decades before. Wycliffe had translated the Bible into English and challenged the authority of the papacy, but he had died in his bed. Hus, on the other hand, would not be so fortunate. His sermons grew more impassioned, and so did the resistance against him. The church excommunicated him in 1411, and when he refused to back down, they placed all of Prague under interdict, shutting down churches and suspending sacraments until Hus was silenced. Weddings halted, funerals were cancelled, the spiritual life of the city froze. Rather than let his city suffer, Hus left. He withdrew to the countryside, where he wrote ceaselessly, treatises, letters, and essays that circulated widely across Europe. His supporters read them in secret, his enemies compiled them into evidence, and then came the invasion. In 1414, the Council of Constance was convened. It was the largest religious gathering in Europe in centuries, summoned to end the papal schism, restore unity, and eliminate heresy. Hus was asked to appear and defend his beliefs. He hesitated. Others had been lured into similar councils and never walked free again. But Emperor Sigismund offered him a letter of safe conduct, guaranteeing that no harm would come to him. Trusting the emperor's word, and perhaps believing that truth would be enough, Hus agreed. The journey from Bohemia to Constance was long. Along the way, crowds greeted him with a mix of admiration and suspicion. By the time he arrived in November of 1414, many believed his fate was already sealed. Despite the promise of safe conduct, Hus was arrested almost immediately upon arrival. He was imprisoned in a Dominican monastery under miserable conditions, cold, damp, and unsanitary. His health declined rapidly. He was eventually moved to a tower in Gottlieben Castle, where he was kept in chains, denied visitors, and given little food. The trial did not begin until months later. It was not a debate. The judges had been written in advance. His books were read aloud, his sermons scrutinized, his questions twisted into accusations. He was not allowed to speak freely. When he tried to explain himself, he was shouted down or ignored. They demanded that he recant, but Hus stood firm. He said he would renounce anything that could be proven false by Scripture, but not one word more. He believed what he had taught. He had taught it in good conscience, and no council, he said, could overrule the word of God. To the church authorities, this was defiance. On July 6, 1415, Huss was brought before the council. He wore his priestly robes for the last time. One by one, they stripped them from him. As each garment was removed, a charge was read aloud. Finally, a paper crown was placed upon his head, decorated with painted demons and the word heresiarch, leader of heretics. Bishops declared, "We commit your soul to the devil." He answered quietly, "And I commit it to my most gracious Lord Jesus." Outside the gates of Constance, the execution ground had been prepared. A stake stood at its center, surrounded by faggots and bundles of wood. Hus was led there on foot, singing hymns as he walked. Some wept, others cheered. History never records a single response. He was tied to the stake with ropes and chains. A final offer of mercy was made. "Recant, and you will live." He refused. The fire was lit. Witnesses later wrote that he sang until the smoke took his voice. One report says his final words were a prayer. "Lord Jesus Christ, Son of the living God, have mercy on me." Flames rose, consuming his robes, his flesh, and his voice. What remained was reduced to ash and thrown into the Rhine, so no relics could be kept, no grave visited. But fire could not erase what he had started. His followers in Bohemia, now calling themselves Hussites, did not retreat in fear. They rose in revolt. Over the next 2 decades, they fought a series of bloody wars against both church and empire. Though splintered and eventually suppressed, the movement refused to disappear. A century later, Martin Luther would look back on Jan Hus and see a kindred spirit. He called him a martyr, a pioneer, a man who spoke the truth before the world was ready to hear it. One story even claims that on the night before his death, Hus had a dream that they would burn a goose, but in 100 years, a swan would come whom they could not silence. Whether prophecy or legend, the dream took root, and the fire that consumed Hus in 1415 helped ignite a larger flame, one that would reach from Wittenberg to Geneva and across all of Europe. Today, statues of Jan Hus stand in Prague, where his name is honored not as a heretic, but as a national hero. His legacy belongs not to one faith, but to anyone who has ever spoken truth against power and accepted the consequences. The Council of Constance is long gone. The throne that sentenced him stands empty, but the echoes of that morning still linger. The quiet defiance, the prayer in the flames, the smoke rising into the summer sky. This was not just the end of a man. It was the beginning of something the church could not control. As we leave the burning stake behind, we carry forward the silence he left behind. And ahead of us, still more names, more sentences, more stories written in fire. Let us continue. A warm autumn sun rose over the Bay of Naples, casting soft golden light across the tiled roofs, the towers, and the distant hills that rolled gently toward the sea. Merchants opened their shutters, sailors moved quietly in the harbor, fishermen repaired their nets. The city, still waking, had no idea that it was about to witness the fall of a boy who carried the weight of an empire on his young shoulders. His name was Conradin. He was 17 years old, and by sundown his head would roll in the dust. Conradin of Hohenstaufen was born into power. His grandfather was Emperor Frederick II, one of the most brilliant and controversial rulers of the medieval world. Frederick had ruled over both the Holy Roman Empire and the Kingdom of Sicily, united with southern wealth and ambition. But by the time Conradin was born in 1252, the family's grip on Italy had already split. His father, Conrad IV, died when Conradin was just a child, and from that moment on, his life was shaped not by love, but by legacy. Raised not as a boy, but as a symbol of resistance. The last heir of the Hohenstaufen line, the final hope to reclaim the southern crown his family had lost. As he grew, so did the legend around him. Blonde-haired, soft-spoken, fiercely intelligent, and skilled in both swordplay and statecraft, Conradin inspired loyalty in those who saw him not just as a prince, but as a restoration. He was said to speak multiple languages, to love poetry, to ride with grace, and to command with dignity. But none of that would save him. In 1266, the throne of Sicily had been taken by Charles of Anjou, brother to the King of France. Pope Clement IV had backed Charles as a replacement for the Hohenstaufens, declaring their line unworthy and dangerous. Charles brought with him French troops, papal blessing, and a hunger for complete control. He defeated and killed Conradin's uncle, Manfred, at the Battle of Benevento. The boy who remained, Conradin, became more than a dynastic rival. He became a threat, a rallying point for those who still believed in the empire's right to the south. In 1267, at the age of 15, Conradin crossed the Alps with a small army of German and Italian supporters. It was not a campaign for conquest, it was a campaign of restoration, a long march southward into history, toward a crown he believed was rightfully his. He moved through Italy like a breeze gathering force, welcomed in Verona, cheered in Pisa. Cities opened their gates. Nobles pledged their allegiance. Even Sicily stirred with hope. Wherever he passed, people saw in him not just a teenager, but a return to something older, stronger. He met Charles of Anjou's forces at Tagliacozzo in August 1268. For a brief moment, victory seemed certain. His troops broke the enemy line. The Angevin soldiers scattered. And then, in the final hour of battle, Charles launched a surprise counterattack with hidden reserves. The tide turned. Conradin's forces collapsed. He fled the battlefield disguised, trying to escape by sea, but he was captured near the coastal town of Astura, betrayed by local barons who feared Charles more than they honored loyalty. He was taken in chains to Naples, and there, for 2 months, he waited. Charles did not treat him as a royal captive. There was no ransom offered, no negotiation. The French king saw no reason to preserve a threat, even a boy. He convened a tribunal of judges, hand-picked men who would declare Conradin guilty of treason, rebellion, and the crime of being born to the wrong dynasty. It was not a trial, it was an erasure. On October 29, 1268, the sentence was announced: death by beheading. Naples stirred with disbelief. Executing nobles was rare. Executing royalty, unheard of. Executing a child, unthinkable. But Charles was not swayed. A scaffold was built in the main square, facing the sea. Wooden steps, a block, and a single French executioner with a long blade. Soldiers lined the edges of the plaza. A crowd gathered slowly, uncertain if they should pray, or weep, or hide their faces. Conradin was led out in a simple tunic. His friend and closest companion, Frederick of Baden, walked beside him. The two had grown up together, fought together, been captured together. They would now die together. Witnesses later wrote that Conradin remained calm, that he looked out at the crowd, then down at his hands, as if contemplating how something once used for command and creation would now be tied behind his back. He knelt at the block, but before he placed his neck upon it, he turned to the people of Naples and spoke. He asked them not for pity, but for justice. He declared his claim to Sicily had been rightful, that he had come not as a conqueror, but as a king. Then he removed his gloves, tossed them to the ground, and said, "This is the last gift of a king." The sword rose, and in a single stroke, the last of the Staufens was gone. His head rolled in the dust of a foreign square. Frederick of Baden followed, then several of their companions. One by one, the scaffold grew darker. Blood soaked the boards. By the end of the day, the bodies of 10 young nobles lay on the ground, their futures severed, their dynasty shattered. Charles of Anjou had made his point. But history did not reward him. In the years that followed, the South rebelled. Sicily would eventually rise in revolt against French rule during the infamous Sicilian Vespers. Charles's authority was never as strong as he had hoped. His name, once pronounced with fear, became a symbol of tyranny. And Conradin, he became a memory that refused to die. Songs were written in his honor. German poets called him the boy king who fell with dignity. Italian chronicles lamented the lost light of a just ruler. Even in death, he stood taller than the men who condemned him. Centuries later, a monument was erected in Naples, a quiet column not far from the place where he had died. Tourists pass it without pause. The stone has weathered, the inscription faded. But if you sit near it and listen past the city noise, there is something that remains. A presence, a stillness, the soft whisper of a name that was never meant to be forgotten. Conradin, a child of destiny. A prince who never wore his crown, a king in the eyes of history, even if the sword denied it. And so we leave the square behind, the scaffold quiet now, the sea brushing softly against the Neapolitan shore. But ahead, more stories remain, more lives taken in the name of order, inheritance, and power. Let us continue. A fire crackled inside the stone hearth of Edinburgh Castle. Shadows danced against ancient tapestries, and servants moved with quiet purpose through the candlelit halls. Outside, the Scottish wind howled across the battlements, biting at the ramparts and moaning through the arrow slits. But within the great hall, the night was warm, golden, and filled with the soft music of lutes and low laughter. This was no ordinary gathering. This was a feast, a royal invitation, carefully arranged. And seated among the honored guests were two boys, young, proud, unaware that they were walking through the final pages of their lives. William was just 16 years old, a young earl, barely more than a boy, but already the head of one of Scotland's most powerful noble families. His younger brother, David, was only 10. They had arrived at the castle in peace, responding to an invitation sent by the Chancellor of Scotland himself. They came with no army, no suspicion, no cause for fear. But behind the tapestries and whispers, something far darker stirred. This was the Black Dinner, a moment that would stain Scottish history, remembered not for its ceremony, but for its silence, for the way warmth gave way to blood, and for the quiet, brutal way 2 young lives were ended, right after the final course was served. To understand what happened that night, one must understand the world the Douglas brothers were born into. In the mid-15th century, Scotland was a kingdom in the hands of children. King James II was only 10 years old. He wore the crown, but not the power. Real authority belonged to the men who surrounded him, noble lords, regents, and guardians who claimed to protect him, but often worked only to protect themselves. Among them was Sir William Crichton, the Lord Chancellor of Scotland, and the de facto ruler during James's minority. Ambitious, calculating, and fiercely loyal to the monarchy, Crichton viewed the growing influence of the Douglas family as a direct threat to both the crown and his own fragile power. The Douglases had long been one of the most powerful houses in Scotland, with vast lands, loyal retainers, and military strength that rivaled even the king's own. They commanded fear and respect. But under William's father, Archibald Douglas, the 5th Earl, the family's political influence had grown too bold, too swift. After Archibald's death, his sons inherited not only the name, but the weight of their father's enemies. Some viewed the Douglas brothers as symbols of future rebellion. Others saw them as inconvenient reminders of a family that had once overshadowed the throne. And some, Crichton among them, believed that the only way to secure the kingdom's peace was to sever the root entirely. So the invitation was sent, a feast held in their honor, a show of goodwill between crown and noble, a chance, or so it seemed, to ease tensions and forge trust. William and David accepted. Their retinue was modest, their weapons ceremonial. They arrived at Edinburgh Castle with polite formality, greeted with warmth and grandeur. The young king himself, James II, was present. Still just a child, he was said to have smiled upon seeing William, perhaps glad to have another boy so close in age among the stiff court of adults. The feast began. Tales of that night vary, but they agree on certain details. The meal was grand: venison, fish, fresh bread, sweet wine. Musicians played. Laughter rose easily, though it was too controlled, too careful. Servants poured generously, and the brothers, perhaps flattered by the attention, allowed themselves to enjoy it, at least for a time. It is hard to say when the atmosphere shifted. Some say it was after the final course. Others claim the music fell silent just before. But what is certain is that at some point, the hall's doors swung open, and a pair of soldiers entered bearing a covered platter. The servants placed it at the center of the table and slowly lifted the lid. Inside was not food. It was the severed head of a black bull. In the superstitions of the Scottish court, the meaning was unmistakable. The bull's head was a symbol of death, a silent pronouncement of guilt, and a warning to all others who might follow the same path. Before the boys could move, the mood shifted entirely. Guards stepped forward, chairs scraped back, hands reached for hilts. William Douglas stood, demanding to know the meaning of the display. But no explanation came. The soldiers closed in, and the brothers were seized. Panic must have flared then. The hall that had moments before hummed with celebration was now a trap. The young king, confused and frightened, is said to have cried out, pleading that the boys be spared. But he was only a child. His words, though royal, held no weight in the hands of men who had already decided. The brothers were taken into the castle's courtyard. No trial was held. No witnesses were called. The sentence had been passed before the first goblet was ever lifted. A scaffold had already been prepared. David, the younger of the two, was terrified. Only 10 years old, dragged into the cold night air, he wept and cried for his mother. Some reports say he begged for his brother. Others say he begged for God. But no mercy came. He was executed swiftly. William, the Earl of Douglas, followed. There are conflicting accounts of his final words. Some say he stood silently, jaw clenched, eyes forward. Others claim he cursed Crichton and Rothesay, the men who had orchestrated his death. Whatever he said, whatever he felt, it ended with the fall of the blade. And just like that, the Douglas brothers were gone. 2 children, decapitated in the courtyard of a royal castle. Their deaths left no battlefield, no war behind them, only a silence too deep to be explained. The scaffold, soaked in blood, stood for hours afterward. A warning, a message. The fallout was swift. Scotland reacted with horror. The executions shocked even those who disliked the nobles began to fear that no title could protect them. No family name could guarantee safety. If children could be butchered, what promise could a crown make? The Douglas clan, though wounded, did not fade away. In time, other Douglases would rise, and some would take brutal vengeance. The family's power would wax and wane, but the memory of William and David would remain a dark wound in the Scottish soul. Even centuries later, historians, poets, and novelists would look back on the Black Dinner with disbelief. The event stood not only as an act of political murder, but as a grotesque distortion of hospitality. In a culture that held the sacredness of guest right close to its heart, the betrayal that unfolded within the castle walls was almost unthinkable. And yet, it happened. Some believe that the tragedy helped inspire later stories of royal treachery, fictions written in the image of real history. George R.R. Martin, in his Ice and Fire series, cited the Black Dinner as one of the inspirations for the infamous Red Wedding. But fiction can soften. Fiction can turn away. History, on the other hand, remains still and unblinking. The courtyard where the boys died is still there. Tourists walk past it now, camera in hand, unaware of the blood that once darkened its stones. The castle guides may mention it, in hushed tones, or not at all, but somewhere beneath the noise and footfall, the silence of that night still clings to the ground. 2 boys, betrayed at dinner, cut down before they could become men. They were not kings. They left behind no children. No final words were written in books of law or psalm, but they remain etched in the memory of a country that has seen its share of violence and still remembers the moment when the feast turned to death. This was not justice. It was fear masked by formality, power masked by politeness, and cruelty cloaked in gold and candlelight. Another name, another fate, still waiting in the darkness of time. Beneath the grey skies of 13th century Wales, the hills stretched wide and quiet, rugged with stone, green with moss, and haunted by silence. These were lands that knew unrest. Kingdoms changed hands here not once, but often. The wind carried both prayer and rebellion, and the soil had known the tread of soldiers and fugitives alike. It was here, in the borderlands near Swansea, that the story of William Cragg unfolded. A man who rebelled, was caught, condemned, and hanged, and then, by the measure of every account, did not stay dead. His tale stands among the strangest executions in medieval history, not because of how he was punished, but because of what came after. It is a story tangled in politics, faith, and the flicker of something unexplainable. A man sentenced to die, who walked again. William Cragg was a Welsh rebel in the late 1200s. At the time, Wales was a fractured region, caught between its native princes and the expanding control of English lords. Marcher barons, men appointed by the English crown to rule these contested territories, exercised near absolute power. Among them was William de Breuse, the Lord of Gower. Cragg opposed de Breuse and the creeping influence of the English lords. Whether he was a freedom fighter or an outlaw depends on which side of the border you asked. He was part of a broader resistance that included skirmishes, raids, and the burning of manors. What began as political unrest often turned personal. By 1290, William Cragg had been captured. The charges were straightforward. He was accused of taking up arms against the ruling authority, leading a group of rebels in an assault that left men dead and property destroyed. Under English law, this made him guilty of treason, and for treason, there was only one sentence: death by hanging. Cragg was imprisoned in Swansea Castle, a sturdy stone fortress that overlooked the town and the River Towel. From its towers, one could see the green hills stretching into the distance, hills that had once offered Cragg cover, shelter, and escape. But there would be no escape now. He was sentenced swiftly. No lengthy trial, no defense mounted. It was the fate of many rebels at the time. Those who resisted English rule were often punished as criminals rather than treated as enemies of war. The message was clear: resistance would not be dignified, it would be extinguished. The execution was scheduled to take place just outside the town walls, at a gallows site near what is now known as Chwam. As was customary, the condemned were paraded through the streets, escorted by armed men, and forced to carry the rope that would be used to kill them. Cragg was not alone. Another man, Traherne ap Hywel, a fellow rebel, was also to be executed that day. The two were brought to the site together, where the gallows loomed stark and wooden against the overcast sky. Witnesses were present. Among them was Lady Mary de Breuse, wife of the Lord of Gower. Her role would become central to what followed. The executions proceeded as expected. Traherne was hanged first, and his body was cut down soon after. Then it was Cragg's turn. He was led up the steps, the noose fitted around his neck, and then the platform dropped. Accounts differ slightly in what happened next. Some say the first hanging failed, that the rope broke, or that Cragg struggled too much. Others say he was hanged twice, once initially, then again to make sure. Regardless, all agree that his body hung limp for some time. Those who watched believed he was dead. His body was eventually cut down and prepared for burial. But instead of being taken to a grave, it was brought to the nearby chapel of St. John at Swansea Castle. There, something remarkable happened. Lady Mary de Breuse had reportedly been praying for Cragg's soul even before the execution. She had asked for the intercession of Thomas de Cantilupe, the former Bishop of Hereford, who had died in 1282 and was, at the time, being considered for sainthood. She claimed that she had made a vow: if her prayers were answered and Crag's life was spared, she would make a pilgrimage to Cantilupe's tomb in Hereford. And then, as the body lay cold in the chapel, signs of life began to return. It was not immediate, not dramatic, but subtle. Crag groaned, his chest moved, his eyes fluttered open. Word spread quickly. A man who had been hanged, whose body had gone cold, was now breathing again. He was not immediately coherent. For days he drifted in and out of consciousness. His neck bore the bruises of the noose. He could not speak at first, but slowly, steadily, he began to recover. By the second week, he could sit up. By the third, he was walking. The miracle, had been witnessed by dozens. Krag himself claimed to remember very little of the hanging. He recalled ascending the scaffold. He remembered praying silently, and then nothing. Darkness, silence. In the chapel, Lady Mary kept her vow. She travelled to Hereford and prayed at the tomb of Thomas de Cantilupe, attributing Krag's revival to the saint's intervention. Years later, when the church formally investigated Cantilupe's miracles as part of his canonization process, Krag's story was included in the dossier. Witnesses were interviewed. Physicians, guards, townspeople, all confirmed that Krag had been hanged, presumed dead, and yet returned to life. The Vatican kept these records. They survive to this day, and so William Krag became both a historical figure and a theological footnote. His execution, failed though it was, remains one of the most remarkable ever recorded, not because of cruelty or spectacle or political shock, but because it didn't seem to work. What happened to him after the miracle is harder to trace. Some believe he fled Wales and lived in obscurity. Others think he returned to a quiet life in the hills. The records go silent. His final death, when it came, was not recorded. But the moment he was supposed to die, the moment the rope should have ended his life, lives on. Historians have debated for centuries what really happened. Some suggest he was improperly hanged, perhaps taken down too soon. Others wonder if Lady Mary's influence led to his removal before death could set in. And then there are those who accept the event as it was recorded, a man condemned and hanged, who survived through prayer. Regardless of explanation, the story has endured, because it challenges what we expect from history, because it reminds us that even in an age defined by harsh justice and swift punishment, the line between life and death was not always as clear as the rope and the scaffold made it seem. The hills of Wales have long since gone quiet. The castle is a ruin, the gallows long gone. But the tale of William Krag remains, soft-spoken, strange and enduring. And somewhere in the pages of medieval justice, between vengeance and miracles, he lingers still. Another name, briefly silenced, then returned, and a fate that slipped, just once, through the fingers of death. Smoke drifts gently over the river. The waters of the Seine roll quiet and slow beneath the sky, reflecting the towers and bridges of old Paris. It is the year 1314. On the Ile de la Cité, just steps from Notre Dame, a wooden scaffold rises above the crowd. On it stand two men, bound but unbound. Their robes catch the wind. Their faces are set. The fire is ready. This is the final moment of a story that began nearly 2 centuries before. A story of knights, of vows, of crusades, and of betrayal. The execution of Jacques de Molay, Grand Master of the Knights Templar, and Geoffrey de Charny, Preceptor of Normandy, was not merely the punishment of 2 men. It was the public destruction of an entire order, and it was done in flame. But to understand how it came to this, to understand why the fire was lit, we must go back to the beginning. The Knights Templar were formed in 1119, in the aftermath of the First Crusade. Their purpose was clear: to protect Christian pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land. These were not ordinary knights. They took monastic vows. They wore white cloaks with red crosses. They gave up wealth, marriage, and inheritance. They were warriors of Christ, fighting not for personal gain, but for salvation. In the decades that followed, the Templars grew. They fought in battles, built fortresses across the Levant, and back in Europe, they gained powerful patrons. Kings and nobles donated land. The church gave them privileges. Their order became a trusted institution, independent, wealthy, and immune to local authority. They even created a vast financial network, developing early forms of banking and credit. By the 13th century, the Knights Templar were among the most powerful organizations in Europe. And then, suddenly, everything changed. The fall of Acre in 1291 marked the end of the Crusader presence in the Holy Land. With the loss of Jerusalem and the coastal strongholds, the Templars no longer had a clear military role. They returned to Europe, their order intact, their purpose questioned, and their immense wealth, landholdings, and independence made them a tempting target. King Philip IV of France, called Philip the Fair, had emptied his treasury through war and extravagance. He had borrowed heavily, from the Templars among others, and as his debts grew, so did his resentment. He saw the Templars not as holy warriors, but as an untaxed, untouchable power within his realm. He wanted what they had, but more than that, he wanted them gone. On Friday, October 13th, 1307, Philip made his move. In a single coordinated strike, his agents arrested every Templar in France. Knights, sergeants, priests, all taken without warning. Their properties were seized, their leaders imprisoned. The charges were shocking: heresy, idol worship, spitting on the cross, denying Christ, sodomy, secrecy. The list was long and lurid. It didn't need to be true, it just needed to be believed. The arrested Templars were tortured, racked, burned with hot irons, starved, deprived of sleep. Under this agony, many confessed. Others refused and died in silence. But the confessions gave Philip what he needed: justification. The Pope at the time, Clement V, was caught in a delicate web. He owed his position to Philip. The papacy had been moved to Avignon under French influence. Clement hesitated. He called for hearings. He issued bulls. But in the end, he dissolved the order in 1312 without a formal trial. The decision shocked Christendom. No verdict had been rendered, no evidence presented, and yet the Templars were no more. But for Philip, this wasn't enough. He wanted closure, he wanted silence, and so, in 1314, he arranged for the final blow. Jacques de Molay had been held prisoner for 7 years. He was old now, tired and worn by imprisonment, but not broken. When he and Geoffrey de Charnay were summoned before a tribunal, both men recanted their earlier confessions. They declared the Templars innocent. They denounced their torture, and they refused to lie. By church law, a relapsed heretic, one who had confessed and then withdrew confession, was to be executed immediately. Philip wasted no time. On March 18th, as the sun set over the Seine, the 2 men were led to the stake. The execution took place on a small island beside the royal gardens, within sight of the palace. The crowd gathered quietly.